The rain in Astoria, Oregon, hasn't stopped for 3 days by the time my 18th birthday arrived. I sat at our scuffed kitchen table, listening to the rhythmic drumming against the window pane, feeling entirely unmoored. Turning 18 is supposed to be a gateway to adulthood, a moment of profound transition. For me, it was simply a Tuesday marked by the persistent ache of absence. My grandfather, Henry Thomas, had been the center of my world. He was a brilliant, eccentric structural engineer who smelled of pipe tobacco and old parchment. He died of a sudden stroke when I was 15, leaving a void in my life that neither time nor my mother's gentle comfort could fill. He died a disgraced man, blamed for the catastrophic failure of the Oakhaven Dam in 1998, a tragedy that wiped out an entire valley and ruined his professional and personal reputation. He spent his final years as a pariah, insisting to anyone who would listen that his safety reports had been altered. No one believed him. "Happy birthday, Chloe," my mother, Sarah, said softly, breaking my reverie. She placed a small, slightly squashed vanilla cake in front of me, a single unlit candle in the center. But it was what she placed next to the cake that made my breath catch. It was a thick, manila envelope, sealed with heavy red wax bearing Henry's signet ring imprint. The paper was yellowed at the edges. "He gave this to my lawyer, Thomas, a month before he died," my mother explained, her voice trembling slightly. "His instructions were absolute. You were not to receive it a day before your 18th birthday. He said you needed to be legally an adult for what comes next." My hands shook as I broke the wax seal. Inside there were 2 items. The first was a handwritten letter. The second was a heavily annotated topographical map. "My dearest Chloe," the letter began, written in Henry's sharp, precise handwriting. "If you are reading this, you are 18. You are a woman grown, and hopefully you still possess that relentless curiosity I loved so much about you. I do not have much time left. My heart is failing, but my mind is clear. I did not cause the Oakhaven collapse. I have hidden the proof. I couldn't leave it to your mother. The burden would break her. But you, Chloe, you have my steel. The map will lead you to the truth, and to the legacy they tried to steal from us. Trust no one with this paper. Not even family. Especially not family. Love, Grandpa." I unfolded the map. It wasn't a pirate's parchment with an X marking the spot. It was a highly technical United States Geological Survey map of the Cascade Mountains, specifically the Blackwood Reservoir area, the very lake created after the Oakhaven Dam was rebuilt by the Vanguard conglomerate. There were coordinates, elevation lines circled in red ink, and a series of cryptic, mathematical waypoints. I didn't notice my Uncle Simon standing in the doorway until he cleared his throat. Simon Thomas was Henry's estranged son, my mother's older brother. He was everything Henry wasn't: slick, corporate, impeccably dressed in custom Italian suits. He was an executive at Vanguard conglomerate, a bitter irony that had caused a permanent rift between him and my grandfather. Simon had shown up unannounced that morning, under the guise of wishing me a happy birthday. "What do we have here?" Simon asked, his eyes darting to the map spread across the table. His tone was casual, but there was a sudden, sharp intensity in his gaze. "Just old things of Grandpa's," I stammered, instinctively sliding the letter under the envelope. I remembered Henry's warning, especially not family. Simon walked over, leaning heavily on the table. He reached out and touched the edge of the map. "Oakhaven," he murmured. A shadow crossed his face, quickly replaced by a warm, avuncular smile. "You know, Chloe, the reservoir is at its lowest level in 30 years because of the drought. The old flooded town is actually exposed right now. If Dad left something out there, you shouldn't go alone. The terrain is treacherous. Let me take you." My mother looked relieved. "That's a wonderful idea, Simon. You have a 4-wheel drive SUV. Chloe shouldn't be wandering around the Cascades by herself." I wanted to say no. Every instinct, amplified by Henry's letter, screamed at me to refuse. But I was 18, carless, and entirely unprepared for a wilderness expedition. More importantly, if I refused, Simon would know I was hiding something significant. I nodded slowly. "Okay. Thank you, Uncle Simon." We left before dawn the next morning. The drive into the mountains was suffocating. Simon played classical music at a low volume, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the leather steering wheel. He asked casual questions about the map, trying to disguise his interrogation as polite conversation. I gave him vague answers, claiming it was just a scavenger hunt for an old pocket watch or a sentimental trinket. I could tell he didn't buy a word of it. After 4 hours of winding, ascending roads, we reached the edge of the Blackwood Reservoir. Simon was right. The multi-year drought had devastated the water levels. Where there should have been a vast expanse of blue, there was a desolate, cracked lunar landscape of dried mud. Protruding from the earth like the skeletal remains of a forgotten beast were the concrete foundations of the original town of Oakhaven. "We walk from here," Simon said, popping the trunk and pulling out a pair of heavy-duty flashlights and a crowbar. I gripped the map tightly in my jacket pocket. The air smelled of stagnant water and decaying vegetation. We descended into the basin, our boots sinking slightly into the crusty mud. I used my grandfather's coordinates, translating them to the physical ruins around us. "Start at the spire," the map indicated. I spotted the rusted iron cross of the old Methodist church, jutting out of the mud about 200 yards away. "Over there," I pointed. Simon followed closely behind me. Too closely. I could hear his heavy breathing. From the church, the map directed us 50 paces north to the remains of the old municipal archive building. It was little more than a collapsed stone square now, filled with decades of debris and dried sediment. Beneath the cornerstone, 5 feet down, we reached the northwest corner of the ruin. Simon handed me a small foldable shovel, taking a larger one for himself. "Let's dig," he said, his voice completely stripped of its earlier warmth. It was cold, commanding. We dug in silence for nearly an hour. The Oregon chill seeped into my bones, but adrenaline kept my blood pumping. Finally, Simon's shovel struck something hard with a dull metallic thud. We cleared away the remaining dirt to reveal a heavy, military-grade Pelican case. It was black, covered in dried mud, and completely watertight. Simon dropped his shovel. His eyes were wide, fixated on the case. He reached down and hauled it out of the hole, setting it on a flat slab of concrete. There was a heavy brass padlock on it. "Do you have the key, Chloe?" he asked, turning to me. He wasn't smiling anymore. I reached into the envelope still tucked in my pocket. Taped to the inside of the letter had been a small, jagged brass key. I pulled it out. Before I could move toward the box, Simon snatched my wrist. His grip was like a vice, bruising my skin. "Give it to me," he demanded. "Uncle Simon, you're hurting me," I cried out, trying to yank my arm away. "Give me the key, Chloe," he repeated, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. This isn't a game for little girls." With a desperate jerk, I twisted my arm free, stumbling backward into the dirt. I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. "What is wrong with you? It's Grandpa's." Simon let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Grandpa was a fool, a stubborn, idealistic fool. He was going to ruin everything. Thousands of jobs, billions in infrastructure investments, all because he thought a few microfractures in the concrete were a fatal compromise. Vanguard couldn't let him halt the project. The reality of his words crashed over me like ice water. I looked at the black box, then back at Simon. "You knew," I whispered. "You knew the dam was going to fail." Simon took a step toward me. "I knew the company needed the dam built on schedule to secure government funding. I knew my father was a stubborn old man who was going to sink the Vanguard contract. They offered me a vice presidency, Chloe. Real power. Real money. All I had to do was make sure his final structural report never reached the state regulators. I swapped the documents. I signed off on the safety compliance. Bile rose in my throat. You killed those people. You ruined Grandpa's life. Your own father." "I made a business decision," Simon snapped, his face reddening with sudden rage, and he spent the rest of his pathetic life trying to find the backup copies he hid. He was paranoid. He knew someone inside took them, but he never could prove it was me. Until now, I guess. He gestured toward the box. "That box destroys Vanguard. It destroys me. I am not going to prison because my dead father sent his teenage granddaughter on a scavenger hunt." He lunged for me. Instinct took over. I threw a handful of dry dirt directly into his eyes and scrambled backward. Simon roared in pain, clutching his face. I didn't run away. I dove for the box. I jammed the brass key into the padlock, twisted it, and threw the hasp open. Inside the dry, pristine interior were stacks of original blueprints, signed affidavits, and a collection of microcassette tapes. Resting on top was a thick legal document titled The Henry Thomas Irrevocable Trust, alongside a small, velvet jewelry box. Simon wiped his eyes, his vision clearing enough to see the open case. He grabbed the heavy iron crowbar from the ground. "Get away from it, Chloe." I grabbed the thickest manila folder, the one labeled Original Structural Assessments, 1997, and shoved it down the front of my jacket. I grabbed a handful of the microcassettes. There was no time for the trust documents. As Simon swung the crowbar, I scrambled over the concrete foundation, the heavy iron smashing into the stone, right where my head had been a second before. "Come back here," he screamed, his voice echoing eerily across the empty, mud-cracked basin. I didn't look back. I ran. I ran with a speed I didn't know I possessed, slipping and sliding in the treacherous mud, tearing the knees of my jeans, scraping my hands on exposed rebar. I heard Simon thrashing behind me, but his heavy leather shoes were poorly suited for the slick, uneven terrain of the ruined town. I used the map's terrain lines in my head, navigating the fastest route up the steep embankment of the reservoir. My lungs burned, tasting like copper and cold air. I reached the tree line and scrambled up the steep incline toward the logging road we had driven in on. I burst through the pine trees and onto the gravel road, just as a massive, mud-splattered logging truck was groaning its way down the mountain. I threw myself into the middle of the road, waving my arms frantically. The air horn blasted, a deafening sound that shook the trees, and the truck's air brakes hissed violently as the massive vehicle skidded to a halt mere feet from me. The driver, a burly man in a flannel shirt, threw open his door. "Jesus, kid, are you trying to get yourself killed?" "Please," I gasped, clutching the documents to my chest. "Please, you have to help me. I need to get to the police in Portland. My uncle, he's trying to kill me." The driver, whose name tag read Dave, took one look at my terrified, mud-streaked face, and then looked toward the tree line where the sounds of Simon breaking through the brush could be heard. Dave reached behind his seat, pulling out a heavy metal tire iron, and stepped down from the cab. "Get in the truck, kid. Lock the door," Dave commanded. I scrambled into the high cab and locked the heavy metal door. Simon emerged from the woods, breathless, clutching the crowbar, his suit ruined with mud. He stopped dead when he saw Dave, a mountain of a man, standing between him and the truck, casually resting the tire iron on his shoulder. Simon looked at the truck, looked at me through the window, and realized he had lost. The corporate facade crumbled entirely, leaving only a desperate, pathetic man standing in the mud. He dropped the crowbar and turned back toward his SUV. Dave climbed back into the truck, put it in gear, and we rumbled away, leaving Simon and the ruins of Oakhaven behind. The following months were a whirlwind of legal battles, FBI investigations, and media firestorms. I took Henry's documents straight to the State Attorney General. The original blueprints, complete with my grandfather's handwritten warnings and Simon's forged sign-offs, were undeniable. The microcassettes contained recorded conversations between Simon and Vanguard executives conspiring to bury the reports. Vanguard conglomerate was hit with massive federal indictments. Uncle Simon was arrested at his country club 3 weeks later, charged with corporate manslaughter, fraud, and attempted assault. He is currently serving a 30-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. My grandfather's name was officially cleared. The media ran retractions, hailing Henry Thomas as a hero who had tried desperately to save thousands of lives, only to be betrayed by his own blood. A few months after the trial concluded, my mother's lawyer, Thomas, called me into his office. The police had recovered the Pelican case from Simon's car before he could destroy the remaining contents. Thomas handed me the legal document I had left behind in the dirt cellar. The Henry Thomas Irrevocable Trust. Your grandfather knew what he was going up against, Thomas explained, adjusting his glasses. He knew Vanguard would bankrupt him in lawsuits to keep him quiet. So before he made his claims public, he quietly liquidated his remaining assets, sold his patents, and placed the funds into an offshore trust in your name. He knew you were the only one who would eventually dig up the truth. Thomas slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was an account statement. The number at the bottom was staggering. It wasn't just enough for college. It was enough to rebuild, to start a foundation, to do whatever I wanted with my life. I walked out of Thomas's office into the bright Portland afternoon. The rain had finally stopped. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small velvet box that had also been in the case. I hadn't opened it until today. Inside was Henry's gold signet ring, the same one he used to seal the envelope on my 18th birthday. I slipped the ring onto my thumb. It was too big, but it felt right. My grandfather hadn't just left me a map. He had left me the heavy, beautiful burden of the truth. And for the first time since he died, as I looked out over the city, I felt like I was finally ready to face the world.